Hello everyone, welcome to the first installment of a segment that I'm calling Unsung Bad Ass. This is going to be a video series where I highlight people that I admire, that I personally like, that I think are worthy of praise, but don't really receive the level of recognition that I feel that they should. Now, the first person that I actually wanted to go over on this segment is a local hero from where I grew up. She was this historical figure. Nobody really knows about her, except people that kind of grew up where I did. But then, unfortunately, I received the news that we all heard that Richard Simmons had passed away. When I heard the news of his passing, I got pretty sad because he is somebody that I always admired. Well, not always. We'll get into that a little bit later in the video. But basically, he's somebody that did go through a lot of hardships and overcame a lot of things to get to where he ended up. So that's why I think he's actually a pretty cool guy. I never met him in person, obviously, but I do think there are things there that shouldn't be overlooked. So with that in mind, this is my tribute to you, Mr. Richard Simmons. So let's start things off with some biological information. Richard Simmons was actually born 3 years after World War II had concluded, which, when you put it in that context, is actually kind of weird to think about. Adolf Hitler is probably in the ground thankful that he missed him by just that much. He would not have been prepared for Richard Simmons. Maybe that accounts for his very cheery and sunny disposition. The world could have been in some sort of state of bliss, and maybe he had just absorbed all that. The man is a legend, and his real name wasn't even Richard, by the way. He adopted that name after somebody who was a big influence in his life, somebody who had helped him through some tough times. His real name is actually Milton. And he kind of seems like a Milton, doesn't he? He was also born and raised in New Orleans, which again isn't something we really picture about him. He was very vocal during the Hurricane Katrina catastrophe and tried to raise money for those relief efforts, but that is where he's from. He's from New Orleans. Although he seems very Californian to me. He seems like he would fit right in with Los Angeles. It's surprising that he's not a natural Californian. Now, one of the biggest hurdles of Richard Simmons' life was his major body dysmorphia issues, and he battled it at both ends. He beat both obesity and anorexia. I don't know personally how big you have to be considered obese. I do recall these old Maury Povich shows once in a while where he would get these 3-year-olds that were like 130 pounds or something like that. Like, holy crap. I don't know if Richard Simmons was ever that big around that age, but the word obesity has been used in application to him. Regardless, we can just consider him overweight, and the problem got even worse once he aged. At one point, he even weighed over 250 pounds. His height was 5'7", which really isn't that short. You picture him as a much shorter individual, but apparently he towers over Kevin Hart. In any case, it is a lot of weight, somebody that's that height carrying around 250 plus pounds. Who even knows how somebody gets to be that weight? I mean, you can understand it now considering all the chemicals and additives they put in our food, but back in the 1950s, 1960s, there wasn't that much additives in it. So to reach that size back then, you really had to have had a problem. It's not like today when you can be a little bit naughty and then still just struggle with your weight because things are just so messed up food-wise. So he understood how much he stood out because of his weight, and he understood that strangers would look down on him because of that, possibly because of other personality factors that he had. And sometime during his teenage years, he started to make a change. Now, unfortunately, this change went way too far in the other direction, and at around the age of 19, he became anorexic. Now, you wouldn't know it from a chance encounter with the guy, but he's a fighter, Richard Simmons, and he beat obesity, and then he beat anorexia too. He eventually found that balance of physical fitness and got into it so much that he moved to California and opened his own gym, and he called it Slimmins. And of course, if you're out in Beverly Hills, you're going to come in contact with all sorts of big shots, celebrities, studio executives, those types of people. We know that 99.9% of people in Hollywood that make it are actors, actresses, singers, maybe directors, but Richard Simmons was just a regular guy with a gym. And with a personality that's as garrulous as the one he had, it must have propelled him somewhere. It's very easy to see that he had the type of charm that people in California at that time would fall in love with. However he got there, he eventually branched out from simple gym ownership and became known to millions of people after he released his series of home workout videos entitled Sweatin' to the Oldies. And I think the success of both Richard and his workout videos can be summed up by one word: authenticity. I mean, who gets in front of a camera while millions of people are watching, knowing full well that they're a goofball in weird-ass clothing, deliberately deciding that they're going to play music that's out of style, but he said, hey, that's me, I'm gonna do it. As far as the content of these videos is concerned, I looked one of them up a couple of years ago because I was curious. I'm going to try to put some of the footage up at the end of the video. I don't really know how YouTube copyright works, but hopefully they won't be heartless enough to penalize me for trying to memorialize somebody. But if you watch these videos, you'll see that they're pretty much for beginners. Honestly, I want to celebrate the guy by replacing one of my regular workouts with one of his workouts. But I go pretty hard at the gym, and I would feel pretty unfulfilled if I were to do that. To put it bluntly, Richard's videos were pretty much for big fat whales. Definitely being crass for comedic effect by calling them that, but that's who Sweatin' to the Oldies was designed for. It's people who are trying to work out at the beginner level. People who are trying to take the first step. And just because I joke doesn't mean I want to hurt you. It's actually all in good fun. I always admire people who are taking that first step. And to be honest, I often wonder sometimes why I don't encourage people more. I remember once I was walking in a park in Brooklyn at my leisure, and I saw this young lady. She was jogging and she was giving it her all, and I thought to myself, yeah, good for you. It's great that you're trying to improve yourself. And I thought of that, but for some reason I just didn't think to actually vocalize it to her, and I kind of wish I did. I wish I gave her some support from a stranger. To some people that might make a huge difference. There's that little part of me that thinks like, no, don't say that because they'll think you're weird, or you're giving them attention that they don't necessarily want. But the truth is most people actually would like to hear that sort of thing. The brilliance of Sweatin' to the Oldies was that it was designed for people that needed that type of encouragement. It's very simple movement paired with this old school music, and it's there as if to say, yeah, you might look silly doing this, so why not embrace it? You're not going to be the only one. It was either that or Richard, as sassy as he is, go around and slap cookies and yodels out of people's hands. Now, when it comes to Richard Simmons, there is an elephant in the room. He was an effeminate man, certainly, and that causes people to assume he was a certain way. He lived his entire life without publicly stating he was that certain way, so I think the best thing to do is just not assume anything. And to assume that's how he would have wanted it. Honestly, I don't really want to address it at all, but he had a certain way of presenting himself, and combined with his style of dress, and the fact that some of the oldies that he played were songs like Sylvester's You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, which is an anthem to people of a certain subculture, or group, or whatever you want to call it, people are going to draw certain conclusions. Really, I think there's two ways to go thinking about it. On the one hand, everybody should be free to express themselves, their full selves, and there was a stigma around this certain thing that maybe he felt afraid to share a certain aspect of his life. But on the other hand, it is possible for a man to be more feminine without being that specific way, and I think that if he wanted us to think of him that way, he would have eventually told us. We are in a more enlightened and accepting age, even if there is still more work to be done. But really the reason that I lean more on that side of things is because I don't see him as somebody that's afraid. He strikes me as a very brave individual. He's brave enough to act the way he acted and give you all those sort of hints or whatever you want to call them. He dressed the way he dressed. Telling crowds full of people, work those buns! And he never was afraid to be all these, for lack of a better word, weird things in front of the public. So I just don't think that he would choose not to disclose something like that out of fear. I think it's more just, you know what, I have a certain image and it is what it is and I like it, so I'm going to stick with that. Let's not sugarcoat it, the man was weird. By today's standards, he wouldn't make a dent in the weirdest chart, but back when he was coming up, I would assume almost nobody really acted like him. And because he was so weird, I don't like him. I don't remember exactly when I became first aware of Richard Simmons. I would assume it was probably in Eddie Murphy's version of The Nutty Professor. But being an immature kid, seeing a weird guy on screen, my first instinct was to go, hey, that guy's weird, fuck that guy. But as you get older, you grow and hopefully mature, and eventually I started thinking, why do I hate that guy? Like, he's not doing anything to me, he's just being weird. Who gives a shit that he's being weird? I was always weird too. Still am. But I was ashamed of it when I was a kid, and I think when we're kids and we're weird, we just try to avoid that and shove it away, and we also maybe try to point out other people being weird in the hopes that it'll take away from our weirdness in people's eyes, and they'll start seeing us as normal people and accept us for what we are. Now, I embraced who I was before this particular incident, but when it comes to Richard Simmons, for me, the point where I began to turn around, I think can be credited to this one particular incident on The Simpsons. So back in the 90s, TVs couldn't exceed the allotted time of 22 minutes, and often writers would overwrite write more scenes than were necessarily, and to fit into the 22 minutes, obviously, the episode had to be cut. And Mr. Burns is quite infamous for being unwelcome to anybody who approaches his doorstep, and when they do, he greets them with the message of, release the hounds. Well, in this particular scene, he does not release the hounds. Instead, he releases the robotic Richard Simmons. So he sets loose this robotic Richard Simmons on Homer, and eventually it plays the song Shake Y'all Booty. And it becomes too much for Mr. Burns even, and then Mr. Smithers just takes out a shotgun and shoots the robot, but then it just, like in the Terminator movie, just repairs itself, like the T-1000. It's not so funny me explaining it, but it's just a pure classic Simpsons clip, and every time I see it, I wonder, how the hell could they just cut that particular clip, because it's one of the funniest moments in all of the series. And when you laugh with someone, you don't want to hate them, and with this particular clip, I felt like I was laughing with Richard Simmons. I mean, the joke was at his expense, and maybe he doesn't like it, I don't know, I've never met him, but I just came away from it thinking, hey, he just made me happy with this little snippet of comedy. Then I started liking him, and I started seeing him more, and I started liking him more. He was on Whose Line Is It Anyway for an episode, and he was just very his jolly self and having a great time with professional comedians. And even though he's not a comedian, he's just a personality, he fit the scene very well. He had a guest spot on Arrested Development too, and I remember this other time where he was a guest on Rosie O'Donnell's talk show back when she had one. She didn't know he was going to be a guest. Her staff actually was going to surprise her, so what they did was they blindfolded her, and Richard comes out and he's like, guess who I am? He's using not his real voice because she would know in an instant, but he's dropping little hints, and she's just like, what? I don't know who it is, come on. And then at the end of it, he's just like, feel my head, and then he leans in and he has Rosie O'Donnell feel his head, and then instantly she just goes, Richard Simmons, and rips her blindfold off because she knows it's him. And he was always doing fun little things like that. Now, I hate the words toxic masculinity. I think they're tossed about very liberally. Personally, I've never mistreated a woman in my life, and I've still had feminists come at me basically because I want to hold women to the same standard that I think everybody else should be held to. But just because I don't think it's as widespread as some people would have you believe, I do think it exists, and I've always hated men. I've never really liked the macho way they make you do things or want you to do things, and I've just never embraced that for myself. And I've never felt like there was anything wrong with me for being that way, but the reality is I did feel sort of segregated from everybody else that did want to chase those sort of things. And honestly, I think if it weren't for people like Richard Simmons who were brave enough to be that, I maybe would not have been brave enough myself to be that. It's not a direct link between him acting the way he acted and me acting the way I acted, but, there could be a sort of trickle-down effect, like it just being in the air maybe just helps me in some sort of way. So that's why I began to love Richard Simmons, because he was the real deal. I never met the guy, so, who knows, maybe he could be an awful, bitchy person. I remember once there was a story where, I think it was in an airport, Richard Simmons actually slapped a man, and the man ended up suing him, and then I think it was Robin Williams, he was commenting on it on a talk show, and he said, imagine what must be going through your head to let everybody know that Richard Simmons had slapped you. So yeah, he could have some bad qualities in him, like we all do, but I liked what I saw.
Not in that way, but you know what I mean. In some ways, he was one of the bravest people alive because it takes guts. It takes guts to be him. It takes guts to go in front of a crowd of people and say, I'm a pony, I'm a pony. And it takes guts to wear this little outfit that he's wearing, his little striped shorts and with his little shaved legs. I mean, they gotta be shaved legs, look at that chest. But, you know what I mean. He didn't back down, he got in front of the cameras and shook it. And he taught me how ridiculous it is to not like someone just because they're unusual. So I have a soft spot for him in my heart, and he'll be very missed by me.
So that was my tribute to Richard Simmons. Rest in peace, big guy. I hope you're up in heaven, and your version of heaven, you get to finally be a pony. Thank you for being an inspiration to millions of people, and an inspiration to me. And really thank you for being yourself. You, Richard Simmons, are an unsung badass.